Thanks, Anand. That's not true. Anand is, this is my 9th stop in 12 days. When I'm not speaking with Anand, I spend a good 10-15 minutes just talking about No Good Men Among the Living. It is the most important book written on Afghanistan since 2011. I encourage everybody to pick up a copy. I actually encourage you to pick up 2 copies, one for yourself and one for a friend, because everybody needs to read it. Okay, so I actually didn't roll out of the womb with a completed worldview. I had a lot of things I had yet to resolve growing up, and I was a person who thought the U.S. military was a force for good in the world. I thought you had to turn to religion if you were to understand injustice in the world. And this is who I wrote the book to. I wrote the book to the person I was 10 years ago. I wrote the book to the person ago. And when I was walking across the country, I met a lot of people who thought like I did 10 years ago or 5 years ago, and they still think like I do 10 or 5 years ago. So it is in that spirit that I tried to write the book. I think people are really used to other people telling them what is wrong with their perspective on the world. What I realized walking across the country is that every single extraordinary story to tell. Everybody is trying to do the best with the education that they have access to, the information they have access to, and the very little free time that they can afford. And everybody wants to make the world a better place under those, with the options that they have. So with that, I kept it in mind as well. I think if people understand that you see them as good, that you see them as doing the best with what they have access to, they're more likely to listen to your perspective and open up. So that's, in general, the spirit I tried to write the book in.
Dick Cheney.
All right. So 9/11 happens. I just recently graduated college. I had a bunch of student loans to pay off. I was looking for a little bit of meaning, looking for a little bit of adventure. I also thought 18-year-olds of the world shouldn't be the only ones that go off to fight this in Afghanistan, which was clearly kind of a pivot point in history when we saw the Twin Towers collapse. I thought people who were experienced, 22-year-olds like myself with some real-life experience under the belt, should go off and fight this war. And we couldn't have, a 9/11 happen again in this country. I thought this thing, we had to prevent it. So I enlisted in the military. I became a member of the U.S. Army Rangers. Training was fairly intense, and I was quickly sent over to Afghanistan. Once I got over to Afghanistan, I quickly realized that I was not fighting for freedom or democracy. I was actually creating more conditions that would lead to other 9/11s. To give some specific examples, we rolled in the 2nd Army Ranger Battalion into a school at probably about 6,000 feet in the middle of nowhere in Afghanistan. The middle of nowhere in Afghanistan has about 30,000 people in it. You'd be surprised at where people live and the density of populations in Afghanistan. And we decided we were going to occupy a school. Classes were canceled indefinitely, and we were going to stage our missions from a school. We had absolutely no idea what we were doing there. We invented missions. We looked for anybody who was suspicious, and I guess anybody who was suspicious was a male or someone who didn't smile when they walked by the school. We'd grab 2 men, 20 years old, throw one boy in one room, throw another boy in another room. The person in one of the rooms would hear a gunshot go off. They would think their friend was killed. What were we trying to do? Extract a confession of some sort. Uncover a plot, for the next 9/11. Identify where Osama bin Laden is. We were grasping at straws, and it was really clear that we were acting not like liberators, but like bullies. I mean, we were the most militarily the most powerful military the world has ever seen, history has ever seen. And we were going into the poorest place on the planet. I remember watching a woman, before we left for a mission, digging this shrub, this bush with no leaves on it. We got back a few hours later. She was still digging. She was using that shrub for firewood to cook her food that night. The poverty in Afghanistan, it's next to impossible to wrap your mind around. We would go in, we look into these clay, dusty huts with our night vision on, with our weapons pointed. And if you haven't had night vision on, the entire world lights up before you. And if you don't have night vision on, everything is black. Everything is quiet. And we'd stare at these people with our weapons. And they had no idea that's what we were doing. And we'd run into a house. We'd grab a male from the household, throw a bag over their head, and take them to Bagram or Guantanamo or whatever. Obviously with no due process, no idea when that person would be returned home. And I really started to grow embarrassed. I mean, this was not impressive. This was bullying. And so I decided I couldn't be a part of this anymore. I had to lay my weapon down and leave the military. And it was a fairly exhausting, challenging process. This was about 2004. There hadn't been a conscientious objector in my unit, in the Rangers. There's a fairly long vetting process to become a Ranger, so it's fairly rare to have a Ranger actually leave. So it was about 6 months. I was expecting to be sent to jail or the big army, to be what the Rangers called a bullet stopper. So I wasn't expecting a positive outcome, but it took them a while to figure out what was going to happen. Then one day I was called down to formation and told Pat Tillman was killed last night in an enemy ambush. He died a hero. You know, I was banished, I was isolated, I'd been ignored by my chain of command, you know, absorbed insults for 6 months, so there was really nobody I could talk to in Ranger Battalion about what I felt was an incredible loss. Pat and his brother Kevin were the only two people that talked to me during this 6-month period. They actually respected my decision. They encouraged me to think critically in a place that discouraged critical thought. It actually said it's actually the most important time to be thinking critically in a place that only really encourages you to say yes to your orders. So, a quick story on how I met Pat and Kevin. I was headed out to a bar after a training mission, and I walked past a coffee shop. And as I walked by, I saw Pat and Kevin drinking coffee. I walked in, introduced myself, and realized that they were exchanging papers that they had written, 5-page paper on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Everybody else was out getting wasted, and these guys were actually exchanging papers. My mind was blown. And so we started chatting. It was about 2 hours in that coffee shop, and I really felt like a different person after I left. I get ushered out of the military within 3 days of Pat's death. They wanted nothing to do with me. I would later find out that he didn't die in an enemy ambush. He died at the hands of other Rangers in a quote-unquote friendly fire incident. And it was horrifying. And the military didn't want to deal with the conscientious objector at 2nd Ranger Battalion and the cover-up of Pat's death. And I think that's what allowed me to leave the military. So when I left the military, and for about 5 years, I kept really quiet about my time in the military. I came from a fairly right-wing family, conservative family, fairly religious family, who was just proud of the fact that I went and served my country. But I felt like I was only half a person during that 5 years, and I couldn't live my whole life as a half a person. I needed to be complete. So sitting behind a computer screen in some cubicle wasn't going to take me to the place I needed to go. So I decided I was going to fly to Virginia Beach and walk to San Diego, California for about, well, Google Maps said 3 months, but it turned out to be 8 months. About 3,000 miles across the United States. And I was going to raise the $3.6 million that Pat gave up when he left the Arizona Cardinals to join the military. My walk was largely apolitical. I didn't talk about anything that happened to me in the military. I was trying to get confidence. And I was also trying to appeal, naively, I now realize, to that 1% of the population that controls the military, that controls all the wealth. And I was going to ask them to make similar decisions to the decision Pat made for the greater good. I raised about $50,000 during the walk, but I met some amazing, amazing people. I mean, after I'd walk into a